Okay, welcome to this meeting on the KUDO community bi-monthly. No, how does that work? Every 2 weeks? Bi-weekly meeting. And it's for KUDO and Cuddle, just to be clear. And the meeting for today is, the agenda is brief, but that leaves it open for discussions if people want to bring some things to the community. Remember that we're under the code of conduct that generally we abide by, outlined on our docs, pretty much aligned with CNCF, and that anything that's shared here is going to be recorded and published to the public. With that, I'm gonna, I guess I could share my screen. Which is just really just a list of the agenda items. The first that I'd point out is that I did a Cuddle release mainly for some, I had a request for internal staff with our company. There were enough things that were landing there that they wanted to try them out. I'm not sure why they needed a release versus just build it, but it was fine. I feel like we can be a little bit more active there. There was no breaking changes. There was just added features, and there were, relative to the number of features in the last release, there were a significant number. Yeah, if there's any questions about that, let's discuss it. But there was a release. It happened yesterday. The core of it was about adding abilities within the test step, which allowed for the reuse of manifests for errors, for asserts, and for applies. We saw that it was very common for people to be using kubectl apply within commands to reuse manifests over and over again in a number of tests. So this should eliminate that completely. It has the same behaviors and that would be expected if we were just doing a standard apply. Yeah, so I'll leave it open. Any questions around that? That I've not merged Cuddle into KUDO, and don't know when I'll do that yet. It's still a chance we might have another Cuddle release within the next week or something. We'll see. Questions? On the Cuddle front, I also did a kind of an issue triage this morning, and reduced some, consolidated, did some planning of putting on milestones, and closed out some that were either old or already complete. So there's some triage done there, outline milestone 040 and 050, and then there's a place called backlog, which is a general location for things that are still being considered but don't see on the immediate roadmap. And in some cases, probably most cases, they require some kind of more information. So they're just kind of holding off into space. Okay, well, on the KUDO front then, switching, it's not on the agenda, but it's worth noting that there are needs to have a Cuddle release targeted prior to June 4th. Normally we would release KUDO. We've traditionally released once a month, and we would probably release sometime around the 4th, maybe after. I'd have to look at the calendar to be clear, but regardless, we're looking to get a release out prior to that. Based on that, I'm expecting that we're going to have a release next week, probably next Friday. I would imagine that we'll have an RC release as standard protocol for a couple of days. Maybe we'll get that out on Wednesday or Thursday prior to a full release. Any thoughts, concerns, or questions around that?
And you mean KUDO release, right? You said KUDO.
Oh, okay. I do mean KUDO. Thank you. Okay. Left on the agenda then is, before we go into KEPs and discussions, maybe we have a newcomer at least that I've noticed. So I'm not clear on why they're here other than maybe they just want to get involved, which is awesome. But I want to open it up for open discussions if anybody from the community wants to bring up any topic. No, okay, not hearing any. The next thing on the agenda item then was namespace cap. Just want to, it was discussed last meeting, and that cap has landed. And it is a third of the way through completion. There was a PR that landed, which essentially allowed for the creation of a namespace as a convenience, but only when there was a create namespace flag provided. That is from the CLI only. There's no manipulations of namespaces by the operator itself. As discussed with the CAP. Again, if you have questions, please raise them. Left in that is two things. Package verify, which will confirm that there's no namespaces within a operator's manifest during the packaging process. And that is because they're not allowed according to KEP at this time. There will be some continuation of that discussion, I imagine, when we get into cluster scope and cluster scope resource management. Okay. Namespace discussion. I don't know if there's anything outstanding. I was just giving a status on what was discussed last meeting and where we are with it. So that opens up the remaining part of the agenda, which is cluster scope conversations. We did have a community meeting 2 days ago, I'm losing track of time. I think it was recent. And I think we broke down cluster scope into two groupings. One is cluster scope instances, which is a KUDO instance being installed specifically to a cluster scope as opposed to a namespace scope. I imagine that KEP might be relatively simple, but the implementation will probably be challenging. Most of the things that we're dealing with the CLI and managing instances and operators and operator versions typically are namespace oriented, and it's unclear as to the impact and how it will be managed. That'll be somewhat of an implementation detail. So I plan to get a first draft of that out today, and I don't know what KEP number that will be. I'm struggling a little bit only because I've got a number of things on my plate, and but I don't want to delay too long. So today, tomorrow, sometime soonish, should get an instances cluster scope KEP out. And then lastly, I think there was a lot of really great conversation around KEP 5. And that conversation clarified that is not really associated with the next KEP that we want to talk about, which is cluster scope resource management. So there will be another KEP out on that. There are some tangential topics between the two KEPs I just discussed, instances and resource management, in that the expectation is that resource management capabilities will change depending upon whether you're namespaced or not. So there'll be some cross references in there, I imagine. And since this is being recorded and the last meeting was not recorded, the breakdown of that essentially is my understanding, and it of course is up for debate, and we will likely debate it as we have the KEP laid out. But the way I'm initially creating the draft is that the ability to create resources within Kubernetes by an operator, a KUDO operator, will probably require some kind of flag or expectation. It's unclear as to where that will be, whether it's the KUDO manager or the CLI at the time of installation. So that's open for discussion. We'll figure it out. It will be a convenience if the KUDO instance is at a namespace. And what I mean by convenience is that given the force or expectation that it should create something, that it won't be managed. It'll be up to the end user to be able to delete or destroy those. And then this is where the difference is. Resources that are created by cluster scope instances will be managed in a Kubernetes way. So with the expectation that if you delete the instance, that there'll be cascading deletes of the resources that it required. So that was a long-winded monologue. Anything I said that was, someone had other expectations?
I had a question on cluster scoped instances.
Okay.
I guess. Does that require a cluster scoped operator version?
I would say yes.
So there's going to be 3 new CRDs, cluster scope operators, cluster scope operator versions, and cluster scope instances.
I think I think like we have to discuss that because not necessary, right? Like could be, but if we have a cluster scope instance and that can use the operator version installed in namespace and get all the information that is necessary to install all the cluster scope resources and own them, like it's not necessarily like we have to do that, but it would make sense, like like having a cluster scope operator version, cluster scope operator. But I don't know, like if what we are trying to solve is just to have cluster scope objects of KUDO, or like what is the underlying problem here we are trying to solve. And from what I understand is like it's just owning objects through a KUDO cluster instance, and that's it. So right now, if I install a KUDO instance and I delete it, it doesn't delete operator version or operator at all, right? So those are like independent things. So I install the operator version and then I install instance, and that would go the same. So I install operator version operator in the namespace, and then I can still like start a cluster instance.
Yeah, and I provided an answer, and I should clarify it. I said yes, but I meant yes according to my mental model. That's what I had in my head. I agree completely with what Zane just said, and my expectation would be that in this particular case, we'll probably have a number of alternate options, and that with the proposed options, we will need to understand the consequences, and then probably we'll have to select one if we're going to move forward with it. So that's a fantastic question. And I guess I wasn't thinking about the consequences of the CRD, but that totally makes sense as well, of course.
Related to our conversation yesterday about KEP5 and this conversation that we had during there about singletons, essentially. And I didn't know if there was a way to solve the singleton problem. Essentially, don't let people create more than one instance or cluster instance by moving the declaration of the structure of what you want deployed into the operator version and keeping it as a cluster scoped operator version, because CRD names are unique modulo versions. Once you install the operator version, the cluster operator version, cluster scoped operator version, you can't have someone else make another one with the same name and the same version. It's kind of a singleton in that aspect, and Kubernetes enforces that. And I didn't know if leveraging KEP5's definition of Kubernetes resources owned by the operator version would help satisfy your singleton requirement, where you guys are really trying to make these cluster scope things, but then only allow one of them. And if you move the declaration of those objects into the operator version where Kubernetes ensures that there's only one of them, I didn't know if that would help satisfy that.
Yeah, I think like in the yesterday, like after Tom you left, this was like one of the options that is like, and I would say like maybe the instances, like cluster scope instance is not the right, like name for the KEP. What we are trying to do is like here, for example, having operator version cluster scope totally solves my problem. Like, like I have a cluster role that I need for a specific version of my operator, and that is operator version, and that installs with it, right? And all the instances can actually use for that one. And because, why is that? Because actually I cannot have 2 or 3 versions of them, right? Like I cannot have a cluster role that has permissions to read the nodes API and then another version probably will have more permission, but that's another version, right? And so that's one of the ways to go, and like one of the ways to solving it. Um, at least from my point of view, yeah, that would work.
I'm really hoping this KEP feels like there's a heavy burden to it, and a lot of variety and a lot of options, and then a lot of things affected by those options. So I volunteered with some fear to start it, but I'm really hoping that some of the content will be more community driven and literally maybe even push, not just comment things, but push options into the pull request when someone sees that there's a need to talk about a larger topic or an alternate topic.
Yeah.
So
I think kind of like for this KEP, I can help you with the problem statement, right? I think that's the
Perfect.
most important part of the KEP. Like, what is the problem we are trying to solve? So like going through cluster scope instance or operator version, that is cluster scope, or the resource management, if we are trying to solve the same problem, I think that would be like really helpful for anybody who is reviewing the KEP or providing alternate ideas, right? And
Yep.
yeah.
I completely agree. And that's actually been somewhat of a struggle. I think people are coming with different imaginations of what we might need. And we should, because this is so challenging and we can't boil the ocean, we should be very specific about what it is we're trying to go after. We can always extend the KEP later to include additional benefits or use cases or stories. So, or create another KEP, I guess. But, yeah, thank you. That would be great. Well, that's it. I'm not sure if anybody, we're pretty much, most people are heads down, pretty active on this. Again, probably the most significant efforts that are not listed, we haven't talked about, is dependencies. I think that's starting to land, which is great. I can't think of anything else that's going on. I've been pretty heads down in Cuddle world. Zane, are you seeing, or Tom, is there anything else that's catching your eye as to advancement of KUDO?
I haven't had much time to actually do anything productive. Just listen to you guys and
Provide
poke you guys.
commentary.
Yeah, right.
You know, I'm going to expect a new Yogi Berra quote from you every time we see each other.
Right. Those are great.
Okay, well, I don't want to drag this out. If there's nothing else to talk about as a community, we can close this out. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thanks, Ken.